So the rumours are that Aaron Taylor Johnson has been signed on to play the next James Bond. I don't personally believe those rumours until Henry Cavill gets in his car, drives to my house, knocks on my door, makes eye contact with me and tells me it's not going to be him. I refuse to believe it's going to be anybody but our boy Henry. Anyway, if it's true, it raises a very interesting question about how he's going to play James Bond, and specifically his accent, because James Bond's accent is very, very important. And if you'll stay tuned, I'll explain exactly why. Hi guys, it's me, and I'm here to make a quick video about something I haven't seen people make videos about before, which is James Bond's accent. Because if you're somebody who lives outside of the UK, you might not have thought about James Bond's accent that seriously. Whereas if you're somebody in the UK, James Bond's accent means a lot. We British people tend to be kind of a little bit obsessed with people's accents, specifically British people's accents. There's a joke that if you open your mouth in England, you're automatically going to make 70% of the people who are listening to you dislike you. And that's because we as a culture have a tendency to make judgments about people based on their accent. Because Britain has a huge diversity of accents. It's a very small little place. But there are regional accents specific to all sorts of little things. And regional accents are kind of common in the United States, for example. I've lived here 20 years. When I first moved to the United States, I thought all Americans sounded the same, except if you were from Texas, where you spoke like George W. Bush. But it turns out that even here in the upper northeast, there are very distinct accents. I spent a lot of time in Long Island, New York. Now I live in New Jersey, and I can tell somebody's accent. I can tell whether they're from Long Island or whether they're from New Jersey. Just as Boston has a very, very thick Boston accent, and Philadelphia has a thick accent, or you can pretty much isolate regional places in America by the way people speak. And the same thing is true in Britain. It's almost like a squished up microcosm of that. I mean, Britain, as I said, is a very small place, and yet regional accents are very distinct, and you could almost tell right down to which city somebody was born in or raised in based on their accent. Except that's not true of James Bond. James Bond speaks in an almost like an accentless accent. And that is no accident. He speaks in a style of pronunciation called received pronunciation. And just as I said, you open your mouth in England and 70% of the people are going to dislike you because they pass judgments about your accent. When you speak with the received pronunciation accent, people are also going to judge you, because to speak with the received pronunciation accent means that you must have had certain things occur to you in your background, in your upbringing. And let me explain that. So, for the most part, yes, you get born and raised in Great Britain and you will develop an accent from wherever you're from, most likely. So, I was born in Hampshire and I was raised in the West Country. So, really, we should be speaking like a West Country accent like this, because, that's the way people speak in the West Country. And there's another James Bond, a member of the James Bond community, who I think is awesome, does brilliant stuff, and has the most beautiful voice. That's Thomas Felix Crichton, of course. Fleming Never Dies. He's got a YouTube channel called Albion Never Dies. And if you watch him speak, he speaks absolutely beautiful. Behold.
Hello, my name is Thomas, and today I'm looking at my 007 favourite adverts starring James Bond star Sean Connery.
There we go. And doesn't he have like a beautiful, rich speaking voice? It's, he could play James Bond. He could, but he's from Yorkshire. So you would think, being from Yorkshire, that Thomas, lad, he'd speak with a Yorkshire accent like this. But he doesn't. And that's because, he's born in Yorkshire, but wasn't raised in Yorkshire. He was raised abroad. And therefore, he learnt school in an international school. And in international schools, they teach you received pronunciation English. And I went to a private school, and my family is quite colonial. So, my parents used to live in East Africa. My grandparents were born in India. So we, too, as a family, have generally gone to private schools or international schools. And in those environments, you get taught a specific type of English, which is called received pronunciation. Received pronunciation, as in you receive the pronunciation from whoever is teaching it to you. You could call it the King's English if you want. And it's kind of like the accentless accent. But it is actually an accent that tells an awful lot about you, because it means if you speak with a received pronunciation accent, it probably means you went to a private school, or you got raised abroad, you probably come from a reasonably affluent background. And that's very much the case with James Bond. You know, he went to Eton and then he went to FETS, and depending on whether you're watching the movies or reading the books or something, you know, he joined the Navy. He went to college in Cambridge, and I think that was in You Only Live Twice that he said he had a first in Oriental languages from Cambridge. So he has a kind of affluent upper class background, and it's very, very important to who the character of James Bond is, because there's this weird like demi-monde of British society. It's not upper class. They're not aristocrats, lords, ladies, marquises, or anything like that, and they're also not middle class. It's kind of like this rare thing of doctors and solicitors and company directors, a certain, not necessarily financial background, although that generally goes with it, but also like a class background, a connection background. It's very often linked to sort of a military officer's background or an international background. So, as I said, my family was very colonial, so that's why we had the exposure to this kind of thing. Thomas Felix Crichton was brought up in Turkey, went to an international school. It's the same kind of thing. James Bond, very international background. His father was quite well to do. His mother was Swiss, I think so. He went to these rich schools, so he spoke with a received pronunciation accent, and it's a very distinctive and important part of the character, I think, personally. And you can tell this because when people, you know, do impressions of James Bond and things like that, they will always speak with what you could call a quote-unquote posh accent or received pronunciation English. And I think if Aaron Taylor-Johnson is going to take over the role, he too needs to speak with a received pronunciation accent, which I don't think is going to be any problem for him. He had me fooled. I thought he was American. But if you look at the actors who played James Bond, it's quite interesting to then compare their accents and sort of think about it. So let's go to the OG, which is Ian Fleming himself. Obviously, James Bond is a fictional character, but an awful lot of his background and who he is comes from Ian Fleming himself. And if you listen to interviews with Ian Fleming, he speaks with a true received pronunciation accent, which is very much linked to his upbringing, which I find fascinating, actually, because it's the kind of accent my father has and people I got raised have. And it doesn't sound like what you might think is the stereotypical James Bond accent. If you listen to Ian Fleming speak, it's more like an old-time British voice. It's much more nasally than you might think. So watch this interview with him.
When I started to write these books in 1952, I wanted to find a name which wouldn't have any of this romantic overtones like Peregrine Carruthers or whatever it might be. I wanted a really flat, quiet name. And one of my Bibles out here is James Bond's Birds of the West Indies, which is a very famous ornithological book indeed. And I thought, well, now, James Bond, now that's a pretty quiet name.
And from that, you can see that is probably the accent that he envisioned James Bond having. An accent similar to his, because, you know, if you spoke like that, it pretty much identified you as being from a certain class. And, you know, Ian Fleming was not upper class. He wasn't an aristocrat, but he was born and raised in a certain upper echelon, a very well connected part of British culture and British society, and that's why he speaks that way. James Bond as a character kind of comes from that same background, and that's why he speaks that way. And back in the 50s, when he was writing his spy novels, it was expected if you were going to be an officer in the Navy, you had to have a certain upper class background. And if you were going to be, you know, a very successful civil servant, you would probably have an upper class background. And Ian Fleming, he failed the Foreign Service exam. He wanted to become part of the Foreign Office, and he failed that. I took the Foreign Office exam, and I failed it as well. So there we go. So there is certain, if you come from a certain part of British society, there are certain things that you are expected to do and paths you can go down. And that is, when I read the books in my head, how James Bond speaks. Then, of course, we have the original actor for James Bond, Sean Connery, who does not speak like that. Now, let's listen to his voice a bit.
Fine. I'll get Hawker to caddy for you, Mr. Bond.
Well, that'll be splendid. Shall we make it a shilling a hole?
Yeah, Sean Connery has the most beautiful, velvety, smooth accent. And it's interesting because it's not quite received pronunciation. He doesn't speak with the posh way like this, which is more nasally. He speaks with this beautiful, dark baritone that has certain amounts of his Scottishness in there, but not quite enough to put you off. I think he speaks beautifully. And I think that's one of the things that kind of set the tone for who James Bond is as a character. And I think he has a beautiful voice. And I think that's one of the reasons why he worked as a character. I think when the original movies came out, if he was a stereotypically posh Ian Fleming type person who spoke with more nasal British accent like this, he wouldn't have been embraced by Britain at large so much, because I think to a certain extent when you hear somebody speak with a very posh accent like this, there are certain other people in Britain who might have a chip on their shoulder about that, or might make judgments about you thinking that you're stuck up, or and I've experienced this myself. You know, I got bullied a lot for having red hair in Britain, but also I got bullied a lot for having this accent, and people kept thinking that I went to like an all boys private school. I didn't. I went to a place called Dunhurst, but people made assumptions about me based on my accent. And I think if Sean Connery had spoken with a proper received pronunciation accent, people wouldn't have been as willing to embrace him. Whereas Sean Connery has this beautiful, like, neutral accent with the slight Scottishness in there, which, it's like drinking a pint of Guinness, isn't it? So yeah, it's an accent, I think, that really helps people embrace him as a character. The next actor to play James Bond was George Lazenby, of course, who was Australian. Didn't even have a British accent, so he had to act and adopt a British accent. And I mean, I think he did a very, very good job, but listen to it and tell me what you think.
My name's Bond. James Bond. I'll get cracking on this appointment, then catch up with you.
The story of our life, James?
Let's keep my martini cool.
So his accent, it's interesting. It's again, it's kind of like neutral. Doesn't have the poshness, the received pronunciation poshness, but at the same time, it's kind of got like a neutrality to it. It's a lot more upbeat and perky than Sean Connery's accent. I personally, George Lazenby, I kind of dig him as James Bond a lot, and I think he brings something really perky to it, and I kind of like that. So it's interesting to listen to his accent, but also as an Australian, the accent he chose for what he thought James Bond should sound like, which is very interesting. Again, it's kind of received pronunciation though. It's like a neutral accent, without having the nasally part that makes one sound posh. Now, the next actor we have is, of course, Sean Connery. Not Sean Connery, oh my god. Roger Moore. We have, of course. Now, Roger Moore, interestingly enough, didn't come from an upper-class background remotely. He was born in Stockwell in London. And he happened to go to a very good school where they taught you received pronunciation English. And then, of course, he went into acting. So his accent, it really is the definition of what received pronunciation is meant to achieve, and that is to give you an accent that completely neutralizes people's judgments about where you might come from and stuff like that. And listen to him speak, and he just speaks beautifully.
You have a nasty habit of surviving.
Well, you know what they say about the fittest?
I personally, Roger Moore, his delivery is wonderful because it's so disdainful, and he has that same delivery that he did in The Saint, so I think he does a great job. His is, I would say, perhaps more posh than George Lazenby's or Sean Connery's accent, and he kind of lent into that a lot. In the books, James Bond describes himself as a Scottish peasant, which is kind of like self-deprecating and not true. In the Roger Moore movies, as they go on, especially when we get to A View to a Kill, where he's playing Sir St. John Smythe and stuff, at that point, he's leaning into, he's from the upper crust. And Roger Moore, there's that weird thing that happened with Sean Connery as well. Roger Moore kind of like blends into every single character he plays. He's not playing necessarily the character, he's playing Roger Moore playing the character. And when you lean into that wonderful show, The Persuaders, that he like plays an aristocrat, whereas he wasn't actually an aristocrat, and he had that the unique upbringing where he was exposed to a good education that gave him that received pronunciation accent, and it neutralized the thing. So this kid from Stockwell, London, could absolutely convincingly play a member of the upper crust and an aristocrat, all because of his accent. I think it's amazing, really. And he did a wonderful job. Now, the next James Bond actor is Timothy Dalton. And Timothy Dalton is the one we make fun of for the accents, because he is a wonderful Shakespearean actor. If you've seen him in any other movies or shows, maybe you've even seen him on stage, just speaks beautifully and projects. When he plays James Bond, there are just a couple of moments, though, where his real accent comes in, because he's Welsh. That's right, he's from Wales. Timothy Dalton is. Beautiful country. Spent 4 years in Wales. But listen to this, and you can just catch those little twists.
I need to use your phone. She'll call you back.
Who are you?
Bond, James Bond. Exercise Control 007 here. I'll report in an hour.
Won't you join me?
Better make that 2.
We both had close calls last night.
You were just in time. Things were about to turn nasty.
Yeah, do you get it? Especially that things are about to turn nasty. That's almost like that's almost like a northern thing. So, yeah, his accent. I don't think people were paying attention to accents as much, but he's the one who sort of veers away the most from having like the posh accent, and they don't really do much characterization in terms of James Bond's background or anything like that in the 2 Timothy Dalton films. He's very much reactive to what's going on around him. So there we go. That's my thought on Timothy Dalton's accent. But Pierce Brosnan brings something unique to the way James Bond speaks when he takes over the role. His voice, just like Sean Connery's, it's like buttery smooth. It's like good toasty whiskey. Listen to this.
An abandoned station for abandoned agents. Your calling card.
Now, Pierce Brosnan, of course, is from Ireland, and he has an Irish accent. I'm not very good at doing Irish accents, so I won't even try. And just like Sean Connery, he has this kind of like the deep baritone, neutral, received pronunciation accent with just a wee twist of Irish in it, which I love. And I think that's another reason why people really gravitated towards Pierce Brosnan and kind of like embraced him, because his accent is just that wonderfully neutral thing with just that slight burr that, I don't know, it's a really beautiful way of speaking, and I really appreciate that. I think it brings so much to the role, like so much dignity and warmth to it. And it's interesting because he veers away from James Bond having the posh accent, but at the same time, he has this beautiful, rich, resonant accent to it. Final actor, of course, is Daniel Craig. And with Daniel Craig, I think they got things absolutely spot on. Now, Daniel Craig is from a city called Chester, the northwest of England. But he is an actor, of course. And I think as part of being an actor, you learn to receive pronunciation. You can do different accents. But if you watch interviews with him, like watch this interview with him from just recently.
I do understand Thanksgiving. It's about giving thanks, as far as I understand. I knew there would be tough questions.
Exactly.
Yeah, he speaks in a fairly neutral tone. You wouldn't be able to tell that he was from the northwest of England by listening to that. You wouldn't be able to tell whereabouts in England where he was from. It's received pronunciation. And as he plays the character of James Bond, he has this wonderful way of speaking. His voice is very deep, and everything he says is very. He speaks in very short, cut-off sentences, but it is a posh accent. I would say a posh accent. And I particularly like the scene in the train where he meets Vesper, because she pokes fun at the fact, he wears this beautiful Savile Row suit and he has this Omega watch and he wears them with disdain. And I think the way he plays the character is the character speaks with a received pronunciation accent, and yet he also wears that with disdain, or speaks it with disdain, which I kind of like. I think there's an awful lot to the way that Daniel Craig characterizes James Bond that is unspoken, even though we're talking about his accents. Obviously, everything is spoken, but he doesn't sit there and go like, yes, I was born in the northwest of England, but of course I went to this particular school where I learned to speak with this neutral accent because that's... No, you don't have any of that. You don't need to give the background to that. You just know that he is a character, came from a certain privileged background. And I think Daniel Craig does a wonderful job implying so much of that with the way he speaks, with the way he acts, with the way he dresses. And the voice, that accent is such an important part of that.
What else can you surmise, Mr. Bond?
About you, Miss Lind? Well, your beauty's a problem. You worry you won't be taken seriously.
Which one can say of any attractive woman with half a brain.
True, but this one overcompensates by wearing slightly masculine clothing, being more aggressive than her female colleagues, which gives her a somewhat prickly demeanor. And ironically enough, makes it less likely for her to be accepted and promoted by her male superiors, who mistake her insecurities for arrogance.
So, long story short, this is almost a 20-minute video now. It's going to be a short video. Yeah, very good. But Aaron Taylor Johnson, if he takes on the role of James Bond, I think he should think very, very hard about the accent that he's going to use when he plays James Bond. And it has to be a received pronunciation accent. The whole point of James Bond as a character is he comes from a privileged background, yet he's an orphan. And he's never fully been embraced by this privileged background, but at the same time, it is the background that he knows. He's not part of the upper class, he's not an aristocrat, yet at the same time, he was raised by people who were at the upper echelon of like the upper middle class, right on that little weird cusp there. And it's such a weird upbringing, and so much of it gets broadcast by the way that you speak. I think that Aaron Taylor Johnson is going to have to think very hard about the kind of accent he wants. And, you know, people complaining, they're like, oh, well, if Aaron Taylor Johnson is going to be the next James Bond, I guess we're not going to have a diverse Bond then, are we? We don't really want to have a diverse Bond. That's the thing. And when it comes to the accent, that's the same thing. I think there are a lot of people, I've spoken to a lot of British Bond fans who kind of, in their head, they like the idea of James Bond actually being a bit rough, who has access to all of this privilege and connections, and to a certain extent that's what he's like. But James Bond is undeniably in the sort of upper class of British society, because undeniably he got raised in a wealthy family. You know, in Skyfall they have that beautiful Skyfall manor, and that's not too separate to how Ian Fleming was born and brought up. It's not my family. You know, I got born and raised in a house. Well, not born and raised in a house. I got raised in a house called Ravenswood House, and my father, I'm going through his history, and you know, his father built the house that they lived in England, and they moved to another house, and all of these houses had names. It's not like a street number. You didn't live at 12 Dorset Court. You lived at Ravenswood House or Highclere or wherever. And that's the kind of background that James Bond comes from. And I think the whole point of James Bond's character is that he's uncomfortable with this to a certain extent. As I said, he wasn't embraced by this privilege that he was born and raised in, but he was born and raised in it. And I think that's a really distinctive and important part of his character. It's that weird juxtaposition. He's not part of this society that he gets raised in, yet he wears the dressings and the trappings of that part of society, and that's what makes him feel like an outsider. That's how I interpret it. That's why James Bond resonates with me. And so hopefully whoever plays the next James Bond, Henry Cavill, will bring that same level of thought to the way they speak as James Bond, because his accent is very, very important. Anyway, maybe it's not. You tell me. I was at Gatherall the other day, and I spoke to a couple of people, and they mentioned James Bond's accent and my accent and other people's accents, and it's really weird. People are like, oh, you got red hair, you look like Rupert Grint, or you sound just like Rupert Grint. And I'm like, how bloody dare you? But I think to Americans, maybe all British people sound the same. To British people, that's certainly not the case. But his accent is going to be a very, very interesting part of the next James Bond that we get. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. It's meant to be a short video. It's gone on forever. But tell me what you think. Do you agree with my whole thought about James Bond's accent? Do you? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. And I will make another video and be back talking to you soon. Ciao. I'm Roland Hume. I've sold 67,000 copies of my books. If you want to find out how I did it, I've got a link right here you can click. And otherwise, don't forget to subscribe. I've got more videos coming soon. Thank you.